The sun hung low over the frontier town of Red Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Wooden buildings, faded by wind and sun, leaned slightly as if burdened by the years of harsh weather and harder living. The most imposing of them all, at the heart of the town, was the Silver Spur Saloon, a two-story structure with swinging doors, a balcony lined with chipped railings, and the faint smell of whiskey and smoke drifting into the street. Inside, the saloon was a hive of activity, a place where the desperate, the brave, and the reckless mingled under one roof, united by thirst, boredom, or the pursuit of fortune. The saloon's interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the aroma of cheap whiskey, tobacco, and the faint tang of unwashed bodies. Wooden tables bore the scars of spilled drinks, knife fights, and games of chance that had long turned rough. The piano in the corner, though missing several keys, still played a jaunty tune when the bartender, an old man with a permanent scowl, managed to coax a rhythm from it. Laughter and curses collided, punctuated by the occasional cheer or groan from a gambling table where fortunes changed with the roll of a dice or the flip of a card. Behind the bar moved Anna, the saloon's maid. She was slight, her frame almost swallowed by the long, faded dress she wore, but there was an air about her that made people notice, subtle yet undeniable. Her movements were precise and practiced, carrying trays of drinks with an elegance that belied the roughness of the environment. Yet her eyes told a different story. Dark, cautious, and almost haunted, they flicked constantly from corner to corner, scanning, calculating, and always watching. The townsfolk didn't know much about her past, and she preferred it that way. Rumors swirled around her like dust devils. Some whispered she had once been the daughter of a wealthy family. Others claimed she had survived a terrible crime. But no one dared ask outright. Anna had learned quickly that in Red Creek survival depended on subtlety. The rowdy patrons of the Silver Spur didn't take kindly to disobedience. Outlaws, gamblers, and cowhands alike demanded attention and service, often treating the young woman not as a human being, but as a fixture of the saloon, an object to be directed and commanded. Many had tried to test her patience, and many more had underestimated her. She endured their rudeness, their leers, and their threats with a quiet, almost imperceptible defiance. It was a delicate balance to appear compliant, yet retain the faint glimmer of dignity that marked her as someone not entirely broken. Despite the chaos around her, Anna moved with a rhythm all her own. She set down mugs of frothy beer, refilled whiskey glasses, and nodded politely to a gambler who cursed loudly at a losing hand. Her presence had become an unspoken anchor in the storm of noise, a constant amid the ever-changing swirl of human behavior. Even the bartender, with his gruff, weathered face, acknowledged her with a nod when she passed. A silent acknowledgement of competence earned the hard way. Outside the saloon, the town seemed equally restless. Red Creek was not a place for the faint-hearted. Wagons creaked along the dirt streets, and the clip-clop of horse hooves was a constant rhythm in the background. Children ran barefoot, laughing despite the dust clinging to their skin, while merchants shouted over each other to hawk their wares. The saloon stood at the center of this chaos, a magnet for those seeking escape, entertainment, or distraction from a harsh and unforgiving world. And it was here, amidst the clamor and clinking glasses, that the story would begin. Anna, quiet yet unyielding, moved through the crowd, her eyes catching on a figure approaching from the horizon, a traveler whose presence would stir the embers of past pain, curiosity, and courage. Little did the patrons know, and perhaps Anna herself barely suspected, that this seemingly ordinary evening in the Silver Spur Saloon would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would bring secrets, justice, and shock in ways no one in Red Creek could imagine. The clatter of glasses and the low murmur of conversation continued around Anna, but she moved through it like a shadow, both present and somehow apart. There was a rhythm to her steps, a silent choreography learned over years of navigating the unpredictable world of the Silver Spur Saloon. Every movement, pouring drinks, wiping tables, nodding politely to the rowdy patrons, was precise, deliberate, a mask of normalcy she wore like armor. Yet there was a tension in her shoulders, a subtle stiffness that betrayed a history far harsher than the dust and heat of Red Creek. She carried herself as though she had learned long ago that the world could turn on her in an instant, and that the smallest misstep could cost more than just pride. To the casual observer, she was just another hard-working saloon maid. But those who looked closely, those rare few who noticed the way she flinched at sudden movements or how her eyes darted to corners before settling, sensed there was more beneath the surface. Whispers about her past were a constant undercurrent among the townsfolk. No one knew her full story, and she preferred it that way. She came from nowhere, the gamblers said. A runaway, perhaps. Some speculated darker tales, that she had survived a violent attack or that her family had been taken from her in some unspeakable tragedy. These stories were mostly fiction, but each carried a kernel of truth. The people of Red Creek liked their mysteries dressed in the veneer of tragedy. They told the story they wanted to believe, and Anna became an unspoken legend in her own right. Her caution was not unfounded. Red Creek was not kind to those who showed weakness, and the Silver Spur was a testing ground for survival. Outlaws lounged at tables with a sense of entitlement. Cowhands threw back whiskey without concern for the consequences, and gamblers took what they wanted with little regard for the rest. Anna had learned to navigate this world with silent vigilance. She had seen men, some drunk, some sober, push too far, test her limits, and even threaten violence. But she had endured, each trial leaving its invisible mark, shaping her into a figure of quiet strength. Despite the constant scrutiny, Anna remained elusive. She spoke only when necessary, her voice calm and measured, carrying the faintest edge of authority without ever appearing confrontational. It was this balance, obedient yet unbroken, that earned her a grudging respect from those who frequented the saloon. The rowdy patrons who might have dared to harm her quickly learned that her quiet demeanor was not ignorance, but awareness, a dangerous awareness that saw far more than most realized. Today, the air in the saloon carried a subtle shift. A stranger had arrived in town, a traveler whose eyes held both curiosity and caution. Anna noticed him immediately, not because he was imposing, but because he moved differently from the others. He observed rather than acted. He listened rather than shouted. There was something in the way he looked around the room, a careful calculation that mirrored her own instincts. For a moment she felt a strange sense of connection, a flicker of recognition that went beyond words. Yet, even as she moved to serve him a drink, Anna's mind wandered to darker memories, shadows of a past she rarely acknowledged aloud. They were not the stories the townsfolk whispered about. These were the moments that had shaped her resilience, the silent lessons learned through pain and endurance. The saloon might have been a place of laughter and chaos to others, but to Anna, it was a battlefield, a place where survival depended on constant vigilance, where trust was scarce and danger often wore the face of ordinary men. And so, she continued her work, poised and careful, hiding more than just bruises or scars. She hid a story that would one day demand to be told, a truth that, once revealed, would shock the very people who had never truly seen her before. The mysterious servant of the Silver Spur Saloon was more than she seemed, and as the stranger's eyes met hers, an unspoken tension filled the space between them, a quiet prelude to the confession that would change everything. The quiet hum of the saloon was suddenly pierced by the sound of the front doors swinging open with a dramatic clatter. A gust of wind carried dust, horse sweat, and the faint metallic tang of weapons into the room. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the piano faltered into an awkward, uneven note. The newcomers had arrived. They were a small group, 4 men roughened by sun and violence, with spurs jingling and leather boots caked in mud. Their faces were marked by the kind of hardened arrogance only life on the lawless frontier could instill. They wore hats pulled low over their eyes, long coats that concealed holstered guns, and expressions that suggested they expected the world to bend to their will. Each step they took echoed across the wooden floor, a steady, deliberate rhythm that drew attention and made the patrons shift uneasily in their seats. Anna's movements paused mid-step. She had encountered men like these before. Their type thrived on intimidation, testing the limits of anyone in their path, especially someone in her position. She had learned early on that their violence was as predictable as it was brutal, and that subtlety could often be the difference between surviving another day or becoming a cautionary tale. Her eyes flitted between them, memorizing the way they carried themselves, noting which hand rested closest to a gun, which men were merely posturing, and which were capable of sudden cruelty. The outlaws didn't waste time blending in. They strode confidently to a table near the center of the room, pulling chairs out with a loud scrape that drew startled glances. One of them, taller and broader than the rest, slammed his hand onto the table. "Whiskey," he barked, voice rough and commanding, "and don't make me wait." Anna approached with her usual measured steps, carrying the tray of glasses with a calm exterior that masked the tension coiling inside her. She placed the drinks on the table, careful not to spill a single drop. "Here you are," she said softly, her voice polite but firm. The men barely acknowledged her presence, their eyes scanning the room with detached aggression. It was then that she noticed the subtle details that told her more than their swagger did. The way their hands lingered near the gun belts, the slight twitch in one man's eye as he surveyed the room, and the almost imperceptible glances exchanged as if to coordinate a silent strategy. They were dangerous, yes, but reckless too. And it was precisely that recklessness that could be used against them. From her corner of the saloon, the stranger who had arrived earlier observed the scene with a calm but focused intensity. He didn't move closer, didn't speak, but Anna felt his gaze like a tether, a subtle reassurance in a room suddenly charged with tension. There was a silent acknowledgement between them, unspoken but powerful. She knew the threat these outsiders posed, and he had noticed it too. The outlaws, oblivious to the silent strategies being formed in the minds of others, began to assert their dominance. One of them leaned across the table, speaking over the clamor of the saloon. "You got a pretty face, missy," he said, voice dripping with entitlement. "Better make sure our drinks stay full." His leer made Anna's stomach tighten. She kept her composure, nodding politely, but her eyes hardened. She had endured men like this before, and she would endure them again if she had to. But this time she wasn't entirely alone. Around the room, the patrons shifted uneasily, sensing the brewing storm. The saloon that had been a lively hub of laughter and gambling now held a tensioned silence, as if the very air had thickened in anticipation of what might come next. Anna's heart raced not with fear but with calculated focus. She knew the arrival of these outsiders was more than just a random disturbance. It was a catalyst, a spark that could ignite long-suppressed truths and dangerous consequences. As she moved to serve another drink, her mind replayed fragments of her past, moments of fear, endurance, and quiet defiance. She had survived worse, and as the leader of the outlaws barked orders and the stranger's gaze lingered on her from across the room, Anna realized something crucial. Tonight, everything could change. The stage was set. The outsiders had arrived. The tension was palpable, and the saloon, once a place of routine chaos, was now a battlefield of power, intimidation, and unspoken secrets waiting to explode. The saloon's usual din, the clinking of glasses, the laughter, the occasional groan from a gambler's loss, seemed to fade into a distant hum. For Anna, the room had narrowed to a single point of focus: the table where the outlaws lounged, their presence oppressive, and the stranger who had quietly observed the scene from across the room. Something inside her stirred, a mix of fear, defiance, and the desperate need for truth to be acknowledged. She moved to the back corner near the row of dusty bottles lining the wall. There, in a dim pool of lamplight, she motioned for the stranger to approach. He hesitated only briefly before coming closer, his gaze steady, quiet, and patient, unlike the chaos that surrounded them. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Anna took a deep breath, the faint tremor in her hands betraying the calm mask she usually wore. "I need to tell you something," she said softly, almost as if speaking louder would make the words impossible to bear. The stranger nodded, leaning slightly closer, his expression unreadable but encouraging. They broke my legs for serving you." The words, though spoken quietly, cut through the tension like a sharp blade. The stranger's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of shock passing over his composed demeanor. Around them, a few nearby patrons paused mid-conversation, unsure if they had heard correctly. Anna swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "Not long ago I served men like those," she said, nodding toward the outlaws at their table. "They didn't like being ignored or denied. They demanded obedience, and when I refused or hesitated, they hurt me. Brutally. They wanted to make sure I couldn't walk away from their demands, couldn't escape. They broke my legs, both of them." Her voice wavered, but her eyes held a fierce, unwavering determination. The memory was vivid. The sharp crack of bone under brutal hands, the searing pain that followed. and the terrifying realization that survival would require more than endurance. It would require cunning, patience, and an unyielding spirit. The stranger's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained focused, alert. He didn't interrupt, didn't pity. He simply listened, absorbing every detail as if the story itself carried weight far beyond the words. Anna's gaze swept over the saloon, lingering on the outlaws who laughed and shouted without awareness that they were now part of a narrative far greater than themselves. I lived through it, she continued, her voice firmer now. I endured their cruelty because I had no choice. But I remembered, and I never forgot. The air in the room seemed to shift. The energy that once buzzed with careless chaos now felt taut, as though the building itself had paused to recognize the gravity of her revelation. Even the outlaws, oblivious to her story, seemed to carry a subtle unease, an instinctive response to the aura of someone who had survived unimaginable pain yet refused to be broken. Anna straightened, her small frame radiating a quiet power. I serve now, she said almost defiantly, but I am not afraid. I will not be controlled, not again. And anyone who thinks otherwise. Her words hung in the air, unfinished but potent, a silent warning to anyone who underestimated her. The stranger stepped back slightly, giving her space, his expression a mixture of respect and calculated thought. He understood something unspoken. Anna's story was not just about pain, it was about resilience, intelligence, and a courage that had been tested in ways most could never imagine. In that moment, Anna's confession did more than reveal a personal history. It shifted the dynamic of the entire saloon. It created a silent alliance between her and the stranger, a recognition that her past, though filled with cruelty, had forged a strength capable of altering the events yet to come. And as the outlaws continued their boisterous games, unaware of the storm their arrogance had set in motion, Anna prepared herself. She had told the truth, and now the consequences were ready to unfold. The moment the words left her lips, Anna's mind involuntarily traveled back to the darkest chapter of her life, a memory she had long kept locked away. The saloon around her faded, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving landscape of pain and fear. She was younger then, still learning how fragile life could be when the wrong people held power over you. She had been serving a group of men similar to the outlaws now lounging at the Silver Spur, ruthless, entitled, and cruel. They ruled with intimidation, treating anyone who dared disobey them as disposable, and Anna, with a quiet stubbornness she barely understood at the time, had defied them once. It was a simple act, refusing to serve a man who had insulted another woman, but it was enough to mark her for retribution. The memory was vivid. The room, dimly lit by flickering lanterns, smelled of sweat, alcohol, and iron. The men surrounded her, faces twisted in fury, eyes glinting with malice. One of them grabbed her arm with an iron grip, pulling her to the ground as others watched with a mix of anticipation and cruelty. She tried to resist, to plead, but her protests were drowned out by laughter and threats. Then came the blow. A sudden searing pain shot through her legs, a sound so sharp it seemed to echo inside her own skull. Bones had broken under deliberate force, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming. She screamed, but the men's laughter only intensified. They did not just want to hurt her. They wanted to immobilize her, to ensure that defiance could never again find expression in her movements. Hours, or was it minutes? Blurred together in a haze of agony and humiliation, she was left in the corner, unable to stand, surrounded by a world that had been cruelly reshaped into a cage of suffering. Every small sound, the scrape of boots on wooden floorboards, the whisper of a passing guard, made her flinch. Each step she took in those days afterward was a careful negotiation between pain and survival. Yet even as her body suffered, her mind refused to break. The brutality forced her to become cunning, to observe and anticipate danger with precision. She memorized patterns of cruelty, learned the subtle cues that signaled impending violence, and discovered a quiet, enduring strength she hadn't known she possessed. Pain became a teacher. Fear became a map guiding her through peril. She endured not only because she had to, but because she understood even then that endurance was power. That memory was never far from her mind. Each step she took, each drink she poured in the Silver Spur saloon, carried echoes of that night. Every smile she gave to a rowdy customer, every calm nod in the face of intimidation, was a testament to the silent resilience that had been forged through agony. The men who had once sought to break her might have succeeded in shattering her bones, but they had failed to shatter her spirit, and now, years later, as she glanced at the outlaws in the saloon, Anna understood something crucial. The past was no longer a cage. It was a weapon, a shield, and a map for the moment of reckoning that had finally arrived. She could see in the stranger's steady gaze that he understood this as well. The brutality she had endured had not only shaped her, it had prepared her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of anticipation rather than fear. The memory of broken legs and the cruel laughter of men faded into something sharper. Clarity. She knew what had been done to her, and she knew what must happen next. The saloon's tension was thick enough to choke on. The outlaws laughed and bellowed, unaware that the dynamics of power in the room were about to shift in ways they could never have anticipated. Anna moved with quiet precision, placing another tray of drinks, her eyes darting toward the stranger for reassurance. But then a new sound reached the ears of everyone in Red Creek, a deep, rhythmic thudding, the unmistakable beat of hooves on hard earth. At first, some thought it was merely a group of riders passing by outside, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, almost ceremonial. The swinging doors rattled as they creaked open again, and all eyes turned. Dust swirled in the doorway as 4 figures appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. Their presence was commanding, and even from a distance, the raw authority radiating from them was undeniable. They were Apache warriors, and they carried themselves with a blend of calm precision and latent menace that immediately silenced the saloon. Their clothing and weapons were simple but effective, each item chosen for utility and symbolic power alike. They dismounted with coordinated grace, boots striking the wooden floor in unison, and the room collectively held its breath. Even the outlaws, brash and arrogant just moments ago, froze in uncertainty. Anna's heart skipped a beat, but not from fear. She had heard the stories, tales of a nearby Apache tribe known for their strict code of justice, swift action, and unmatched skill in handling threats to their land or allies. They were fierce, yes, but not mindless. There was intelligence, strategy, and an almost mystical sense of timing in the way they operated. She had never seen them herself, yet the stories alone had been enough to keep many would-be troublemakers wary. The leader of the warriors, a tall figure with an unflinching gaze, stepped forward, scanning the room. His eyes met Anna's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. There was respect there, and a recognition of the suffering she had endured. It was clear they had come for justice, not chaos. Without a word, the Apache began to move through the saloon. Their presence alone altered the atmosphere. The outlaws, who had been cocky just moments before, now exchanged uneasy glances. They were experienced men, but the disciplined, unyielding posture of the warriors made them suddenly small, vulnerable. One of the Apache reached for a belt, producing a weapon, but not with the intent to strike immediately. It was a display of readiness, a reminder that any aggression would be met decisively. The outlaws attempted to assert control, laughing nervously, trying to mask the fear creeping into their movements. Who are you?" stammered the tallest among them, his voice cracking ever so slightly. But the Apache did not answer verbally. Instead, they approached methodically, eyes sharp, their movements deliberate. With swift precision, they disarmed the nearest outlaw, securing his weapon without a struggle. A second man found his chair tipped over as he tried to make a move, and a third realized that escape was impossible as 2 warriors blocked the doorway. The saloon went silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards under disciplined steps. The patrons watched in awe and shock, witnessing a power they had only heard about in whispers and legends. The Apache's presence was not chaos, it was control, justice, and a stark warning. Their movements were almost ritualistic, a demonstration of authority that left no room for resistance or deceit. Anna stood a little straighter, feeling the tension in her body ease. She had survived brutality before, but now, with the warriors in the room, a new force had arrived. One that promised not just protection, but vindication. The outlaws' arrogance crumbled, replaced by fear and a dawning understanding that their recklessness had finally met its match. And as the Apache prepared to deliver their justice, the patrons of the Silver Spur Saloon could only watch, mouths agape, knowing that what was about to happen would be remembered long after the dust settled. The Apache warriors moved with a silent authority that seemed to command the very air around them. Every step they took, deliberate and precise, amplified the stark contrast between the rowdy outlaws and the disciplined, unyielding force entering the room. The townsfolk, who had been sipping drinks or watching the scene unfold from the edges of the saloon, suddenly felt the weight of something larger than themselves descend upon the space. Murmurs spread like wildfire. "Are they real?" one bartender whispered, his hands frozen on a rag he had been using to wipe glasses. "I've heard the stories, but I never thought—" His voice trailed off, leaving only awe in its place. At the back of the saloon, a group of gamblers who had been loudly bickering over cards fell silent. Their faces, once smug and confident, drained of color as the warriors moved closer to the outlaws. A few of them instinctively shifted toward the exit, but there was nowhere to go. The Apache blocked all avenues of escape. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the sound of hooves and the sudden tension that radiated from the saloon. They pressed against the windows, peering in with wide eyes. Mothers held children close. Men instinctively reached for whatever protection they could find, and whispers of justice and revenge passed from person to person. It was as if the mere presence of the Apache had rewritten the rules of the town. Lawlessness no longer reigned. Inside, Anna felt a mixture of relief and empowerment. She had endured pain and cruelty for so long, but now she watched as a force she respected and trusted asserted itself. The warriors' actions were calculated, surgical even. They didn't act out of rage, but out of a strict adherence to a code of justice. Every move they made sent a clear message. Wrongdoing would not be ignored. The outlaws, for their part, were visibly shaken. Their earlier bravado dissolved under the disciplined, unwavering gaze of the warriors. One man attempted a sneer, but it faltered into a nervous cough. Another shifted in his chair, hand twitching toward a concealed weapon, only to find a warrior's presence blocking even the thought of resistance. Fear replaced arrogance, and for the first time the outlaws realized that they were not in control. The townsfolk could hardly believe their eyes. Men who had terrorized the saloon, who had laughed at warnings and mocked authority, were now silent, restrained not by chains or violence, but by the sheer power of presence and reputation. It was shocking, almost unbelievable, to see justice enacted with such precision and respect for the rules of engagement. This was not random cruelty. This was accountability. Children who had peered through the windows gasped in awe, while older men muttered in disbelief, recounting tales they had heard from wandering travelers about the Apache and their legendary skill. No one had ever imagined witnessing it firsthand in Red Creek. The stories they had dismissed as frontier legend were unfolding before them, tangible and undeniable. Anna's eyes met the strangers again, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The Apache had arrived not only to protect her, but to restore balance to the chaotic, lawless environment of the saloon. And as the warriors continued their methodical approach, the townsfolk began to understand that what they were witnessing was more than punishment. It was a demonstration of power, courage, and the consequences of hubris. In that charged silence, the Silver Spur Saloon transformed from a place of casual disorder to a theater of reckoning. Every patron, every onlooker, felt the magnitude of what was happening. The shock on their faces wasn't just about the fear of violence. It was the dawning realization that justice, swift and uncompromising, had its own rules and champions, and that those who defied them would be made to answer. The saloon had become deathly quiet, the kind of silence that carried the weight of expectation. Every patron, every onlooker waited with bated breath, unsure whether the scene about to unfold would be brutal or precise, chaotic or deliberate. The Apache warriors moved with the quiet confidence of those who had faced far worse than drunken outlaws. They carried authority not with threats or loud proclamations, but with an unshakable presence. The leader of the group stepped forward first, his gaze sweeping the room, assessing each outlaw with precision. One by one, their arrogant stances faltered under his scrutiny. The tallest man, the one who had barked orders moments earlier, tried to maintain his composure. "We don't want trouble," he said, his voice betraying the first hint of fear. The warrior didn't speak. Instead, he raised a hand, and two of his companions moved with surgical efficiency. Within seconds, the outlaws found their weapons disarmed, their guns rendered useless not through destruction but through control, skillful manipulation of leverage and position that left no opportunity for resistance. One outlaw tried to reach for a hidden knife, only to have it deftly pinned to the table by a pair of firm hands. It wasn't violence for violence's sake. Each action was deliberate, each punishment tailored. One man, notorious for intimidation and threats, was made to sit quietly in a chair in full view of the saloon, humiliated by his powerlessness, while the warrior who had cornered him remained calm, unyielding. Another, known for petty theft and intimidation of women, was commanded to return everything he had stolen and apologize publicly, a small but symbolic act that reverberated through the room with unexpected force. The third outlaw, who had mocked Anna the most, was subjected to the silent, piercing gaze of the Apache leader. His bravado crumbled instantly. Without a word, he understood that any further defiance would be met, not with random cruelty but with precise consequences. His body tensed, then slumped, the lesson sinking in. Arrogance without accountability carried a price. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence. They had expected a bloody showdown, a typical frontier punishment that left chaos and fear in its wake. What they witnessed instead was something far more shocking, a controlled, almost ritualistic application of justice. The Apache were not killers today. They were arbiters, enforcers of a moral code that transcended the lawless whims of Red Creek. Their actions were swift, disciplined, and deeply unsettling to anyone accustomed to chaos being ruled by brute strength alone. Anna felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over her. The men who had once broken her, who had once believed fear could dominate her, were now facing a new kind of power, one that respected strength, courage, and consequence. She realized that the warrior's presence had not only protected her, but had exposed the hollow nature of the outlaw's bravado. They were cowards, finally made accountable. The stranger who had watched from the sidelines nodded subtly, his expression reflecting admiration for both Anna and the Apache. He understood that the lesson here extended beyond the immediate punishment. It was a demonstration that justice could be exacted with intelligence and restraint, that courage and moral authority could outweigh fear and cruelty. By the time the last of the outlaws had been disarmed, humiliated, or corrected, the saloon had transformed. The air was no longer charged with tension but with awe, respect, and a hint of fear. Every patron understood that a new standard had been set. The Apache had delivered justice in a way that shocked them, not with bloodshed, but with the precision, authority, and unspoken code that left no room for argument. And in that charged silence, Anna realized something profound. The past that had haunted her, the brutality she had endured, had prepared her not just to survive but to witness and participate in a justice far greater than vengeance. The outlaws had learned their lesson, the saloon had seen true authority, and the story of that night would ripple through Red Creek for years to come. The echoes of the Apache's intervention lingered in the Silver Spur saloon like a heavy, electric charge. The outlaws had been neutralized, their weapons removed, their arrogance stripped bare, yet Anna's attention was not on them. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the silent awe of the patrons, the gamblers, the bartenders, the cowhands, who had watched power and justice unfold before them in a way they had never imagined. For the first time in years, Anna felt the weight of her own strength settle fully upon her shoulders. She had endured pain so extreme it could have shattered her, yet here she stood upright, composed, and unafraid. The experience had carved a resilience into her very being, a quiet authority that radiated without a word. It was not brute strength that made her formidable. It was endurance, intelligence, and the courage to act when circumstances demanded it. Slowly, she began to move through the saloon, her steps deliberate, measured. She acknowledged the patrons with subtle nods, her composure a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. There was an unspoken acknowledgement in the air. She was no longer merely the quiet maid serving drinks. She was a woman who had survived brutality, who had endured the worst, and who now commanded the respect of everyone around her. The stranger who had arrived earlier approached, his expression a mix of admiration and quiet pride. "You've handled this remarkably," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. She gave a small, wry smile. "I've survived worse," she replied almost matter-of-factly. There was no arrogance in her tone, only the clarity of someone who had faced fear, endured it, and emerged stronger. The townsfolk, who had been previously passive observers, began to murmur among themselves. Eyes that had once dismissed her as just another servant now saw her in a new light. The whispered conversations carried a mix of awe and respect. She didn't even flinch. Look at her. She's unbroken. She survived, and she's still standing. Even the bartender, a grizzled man with decades of experience dealing with trouble, nodded subtly in her direction, as if acknowledging that she had earned something far beyond gratitude. The patron's respect was tangible, forming a quiet aura around her. She had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of resilience and courage in the face of cruelty. Anna's gaze returned to the outlaws, now sitting subdued and ashamed, the Apache warriors watching from the doorway. She felt no desire for vengeance. Those days of fear had forged a different strength, one that did not need to humiliate or harm further. Instead, her power lay in her composure, her survival, and her presence as a reminder that cruelty and intimidation would not go unchallenged. The Apache leader gave her a brief nod before mounting his horse, a silent acknowledgement of her endurance and bravery. As the warriors departed, the room seemed to exhale, the tension slowly dissipating, replaced by an almost reverent calm. Anna stood taller, not because anyone forced her to, but because she knew her own worth, her own capacity to endure and command respect. In that moment, the Silver Spur Saloon was transformed. It was no longer merely a place of drinks, gambling, and reckless bravado. It had become a space where courage and resilience were recognized, where fear no longer dictated behavior, and where Anna, once a quiet maid in the background, had emerged as the center of a moral reckoning. She moved back behind the bar, her step steady and confident. The patrons now looked at her differently, their earlier whispers now silent respect. She had not only survived, but she had also commanded a room without raising her voice, a feat far more remarkable than any gunfight or display of force could achieve. Anna's strength was no longer hidden. It was visible to all, undeniable and permanent, and in that quiet acknowledgement she felt a sense of liberation, a realization that surviving brutality was no longer enough. Now she could shape the space around her, command respect, and redefine what it meant to endure. The Silver Spur Saloon slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though it was a rhythm forever changed. The laughter, clinking of glasses, and low murmurs of conversation returned, but now they carried a quieter, more cautious energy. The townsfolk moved with an unspoken awareness that the events of the evening had shifted the balance of power in Red Creek. They had witnessed justice executed with precision and restraint, and it had left an indelible mark on everyone present. Anna stood behind the bar, her hand steady as she poured drinks, but her posture had changed. She no longer moved merely to serve. She moved with confidence, her every gesture carrying a subtle authority. Patrons approached her with newfound respect, no longer seeing her as just the quiet maid who had always worked in the background. She had earned a presence, a reputation that extended beyond her role in the saloon. The stranger, who had observed the unfolding events with calm intensity, finally approached her. "You are incredible," he said softly, his admiration genuine. "I've seen a lot in my travels, but I've rarely seen someone command a room the way you did, without violence, without intimidation." Anna allowed herself a small smile, feeling the weight of his words. She had survived brutality, endured injustice, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she realized the depth of her own resilience. The townsfolk, too, began to reflect on what had happened. Children whispered to each other about the Apache warriors, while adults shared hushed stories, amazed at the precision and authority they had witnessed. Red Creek was a town that had grown accustomed to chaos and lawlessness, but tonight had demonstrated that courage, intelligence, and moral strength could reshape even the wildest frontier. Anna's eyes wandered to the outlaws, now seated in quiet humiliation. Their presence was a reminder of the night's lessons. Arrogance and cruelty could be countered, not merely with brute force, but with courage, strategy, and moral clarity. She had no desire for revenge. The justice had been delivered, and that was enough. Outside, the Apache warriors had mounted their horses and disappeared into the fading light of the horizon, leaving behind a lingering sense of awe and respect. Their intervention had been swift, precise, and transformative, showing the townsfolk that true power was rooted not in intimidation or fear, but in skill, presence, and the courage to act when necessary. Anna reflected quietly on her own journey. She had endured suffering that could have broken her entirely, Yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. The events of the night had crystallized a truth she had long felt, but had rarely seen mirrored in others. Courage and resilience could not only protect the vulnerable, they could redefine the very environment around them. As the evening wore on, the Silver Spur Saloon returned to its livelier pace, though no one spoke of the night in idle terms. The story of Anna and the Apache intervention would ripple through Red Creek for years, a cautionary tale for the reckless and a source of inspiration for the courageous. Anna continued her work, her movements calm, her presence commanding, her mind at ease for the first time in years. The stranger lingered for a while longer, watching the saloon's rhythm, before finally tipping his hat and moving on, leaving Anna with a profound sense of connection and understanding that needed no words. In the end, Red Creek had witnessed more than a single act of justice. It had witnessed the emergence of a woman who had endured pain, commanded respect, and reshaped her world without raising her voice. And Anna, the once quiet saloon maid, now stood as a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of surviving and thriving against all odds. The saloon's doors swung gently in the evening breeze. The murmur of life resumed, and Anna, unbroken and resolute, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she had already conquered the greatest trial of all, fear itself.